I spent 40 years managing a bank's vault, but it only took 5 for my children to empty mine. My name is Arthur. I am 74 years old, and today I am going to tell you why the money you give your adult children is killing their future and destroying what is left of your life. I know numbers. I spent my entire career behind thick glass and steel doors, protecting millions of dollars with surgical precision. I was the man people came to when they wanted their futures secured. But I was a fool who did not understand the most basic transaction of all. I thought I was buying a legacy, but I was actually financing my own abandonment. Look at me now. I sit in a small condo that feels like a cage compared to the suburban house where I raised my family. I had to sell that house, the one with the oak trees and the porch, just to wipe away debts that were never mine to begin with. I spend my mornings staring at a spreadsheet, counting out pennies to make sure I can cover the monthly fees for this tiny space. There is a bitter, cold irony in being a retired bank manager who has to check his balance before buying a carton of milk. I spent my life managing other people's wealth, yet I let my own children treat me like a machine that dispenses cash without a limit. I believed the most dangerous lie a parent can tell themselves, that financial support is the ultimate proof of love. I thought that if I kept their lives comfortable, they would keep me close. I was wrong, and the silence in these walls is the only thing I have left to show for every dollar I gave away. I managed the wealth of strangers, but I failed to manage the greed of my own blood. I thought I was their safety net, but I was just their victim. Every time I reached into my savings to solve their problems, I was digging my own grave. I was a professional at calculating interest, yet I never saw the cost of my own generosity until it was too late. Now, I count the hours instead of the dollars, wondering how a man who knew so much about money could be so bankrupt in his own home. This was my life, a series of calculated risks that all led to one massive, irreversible loss. You think you are helping them, but you are only ensuring that when the well runs dry, you will be the one left thirsty and alone. I used to sit in an office that smelled of expensive cologne and old paper. My desk was a heavy slab of mahogany, a solid barrier between me and the world, and I liked it that way. I was the man with the answers, the one who moved millions with a signature. When Courtney called at 35 because her boutique was failing again, I didn't see a woman who couldn't manage a budget. I saw a little girl who needed her father to be a hero. I reached for my checkbook with a smile, feeling that rush of importance that only a provider knows. It was my drug. I paid for Ryan's apartment for 3 years because I told myself the economy was a monster he wasn't ready to face yet. I lived on autopilot, convinced that every wire transfer was a brick in a fortress that would protect my family forever. I valued the wrong things. I thought a father's worth was measured in the digits of a bank balance. I was a king in a paper crown, handing out my kingdom piece by piece while the walls were rotting from the inside. I ignored the red flags like a man walking blindfolded toward a cliff. I thought I was buying their respect, their time, their future gratitude. I was wrong. I was only buying their silence until the next bill was due. I stayed in that suburban house, looking at the empty rooms where they used to play, and I felt proud that I could still solve their problems from a distance. I was so busy being the solution that I never realized I was becoming the victim. I dipped into my retirement funds to pay off Ryan's credit cards, thinking it was just a temporary dip. I sold the house I loved, the one with the oak trees and the porch where their mother and I watched them grow, just to clear debts I never signed for. I thought it was a sacrifice. I thought it was love. But you cannot buy a seat at a table where you are only seen as a guest with a full wallet. The illusion started to crack on a Tuesday night that changed everything, leaving me with a phone in my hand and a pain in my gut that no amount of money could fix. 6 months ago, on a Tuesday night that smelled of rain and old medicine, the ceiling of my world finally collapsed. It started as a dull throb in my lower left side, then it turned into a jagged blade, twisting every time I took a breath. Diverticulitis. It feels like your body is trying to digest itself from the inside out. I was hunched over the edge of my bed, my knuckles white against the mattress, sweat stinging my eyes as I tried to stay upright. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Courtney's number. I just needed a ride. 5 miles to the emergency room. That was all I was asking for. When she picked up, I could hear the distant clink of a glass in the background. I told her I was in trouble, that the pain was blacking out my vision. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that felt colder than the draft coming through the window. She sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated exhaustion, and told me she had just finished a grueling business dinner with the partners. She said she was too drained to get back behind the wheel, that her head was spinning from the stress of the day. But then, before I could even tell her I understood, her voice shifted. It became light, almost transactional. She asked if I could go ahead and advance the $12,000 for the grandkids' private school tuition, because the deadline was Friday and her accounts were tight. I sat there in the dark, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my eldest daughter calculate her children's future while I was struggling to survive my own present. I hung up without saying another word. I called an Uber. The ride was a blur of yellow streetlights and the smell of artificial pine, my head resting against the cold glass of the door. In the hospital waiting room, under fluorescent lights so bright they made my skin look like gray parchment, I sat on a blue plastic chair that felt like ice. I watched families holding hands and couples whispering in the corners, but I was just a man with a wallet that had grown too thin and a heart that had finally broken. I realized then that I hadn't raised children, I had raised creditors. I was sitting there, bleeding out my dignity, waiting for a doctor to tell me if I would live, while my own blood was at home, waiting for the next wire transfer to clear. The silence of that waiting room was the loudest thing I had ever heard, and it told me a truth I wasn't ready to face until the nurse finally called my name, and I realized I was walking toward the end of my life, completely and utterly alone. I returned from the hospital in a daze, the scent of antiseptic still clinging to my clothes like a shroud. I sat in my armchair, the one that used to belong in the grand living room of my old house, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I opened my bank app. I looked at the dwindling balance, and I felt a surge of that old familiar sickness. But I told myself a lie. I told myself that Courtney was just having a bad day, that the stress of her world had blinded her to mine. I thought that if I could just bridge the gap one last time, if I could show her I was still the provider, she would finally see me as a father again. I sent her a message saying I had transferred $5,000 for her business overhead, a final push to get her through the month. I did not mention the hospital. I did not mention the Uber or the cold blue chair. I kept my pain tucked away like a shameful secret, believing that my strength was measured by how much I could bleed without making a sound. I did the same for Ryan. I paid his rent for the next quarter, emptying a savings account I had sworn never to touch. I sat there for a week, waiting for the phone to ring with a voice that did not start with a request. I kept the condo spotless, expecting a visit that never came. I was a man trying to buy a seat at his own funeral while he was still breathing. I thought my generosity was a bridge, but it was just a pier that led into the middle of a dark, empty ocean. I spent my nights staring at the dark screen of my television, reflected in the glass, seeing a ghost of the man I used to be. I was still convinced that love was a transaction, and I was determined to be the best customer they ever had. Then, a package arrived at my door by mistake, addressed to Courtney but delivered to my unit. It was a set of designer luggage, the kind that costs more than my monthly mortgage. Inside the packing slip was a receipt dated the day after I sent her that $5,000. She was not saving her business. She was planning a vacation to the Maldives. My hands started to shake so hard, the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. I realized that while I was skipping meals to keep her afloat, she was already picking out the colors for her next escape from reality. I stood up, my legs weak, and I walked to the kitchen where the ledger of my life lay open on the counter. And that was when I saw the shadow moving past my window. I feel a bit exposed sharing all of this with you. It is not easy to admit that a man who was paid to be smart with money ended up being so foolish with his heart. But sometimes, the silence in this small condo gets too heavy, and the walls start to feel like they are closing in. Where are you listening to this from right now? Is the sun still out where you are, or has the evening already settled in? Please let me know in the comments. I would truly love to know who is keeping me company today, and if you have ever felt this same kind of emptiness, because right now, It feels like you are the only ones left who are actually listening. I stood there in that kitchen, the receipt for the designer luggage still crinkling in my hand like a dead leaf. The shadow moving past my window was just a neighbor, someone whose name I did not even know, living a life that did not involve financing a luxury vacation for a daughter who could not drive 5 miles to save her father from a hospital bed. I looked down at my hands, the skin thin as parchment, and I finally saw the blood on them. It was not from the surgery. It was from the decades I spent cutting pieces of my own future to feed children who were already full. I realized in that cold, vibrating silence that I had become a professional victim. I was the one who had trained them to view my heartbeat as a metronome for their spending. Every time I hit send on a bank transfer, I was pushing them further away from the adults they were supposed to be. I thought I was building a bridge, but I was actually digging a trench between us, one filled with resentment on their side and desperation on mine. I had spent 40 years guarding a vault for strangers, protecting every cent with my life. Yet I had left the vault of my own dignity wide open for my own blood to pillage. I was not buying their love. I was renting their presence, and the rent had just become higher than I could ever afford to pay. The realization hit me harder than the sickness ever could. My generosity was a poison, a slow-acting toxin that had atrophied their character while it slowly starved my own soul. I had made myself a machine, a source of endless capital, and machines do not get invited to dinner. Machines do not get driven to the hospital. They just get used until they break, and then they are discarded. I looked at the phone on the counter, that black mirror that had only ever reflected my own failure to say the word no. I realized that the silence I feared so much was actually the only honest thing left in my life. I reached out and touched the screen, my finger hovering over the contact names I had cherished more than my own breath. And in that moment, the Arthur who took orders and paid for mistakes died right there on the linoleum floor. I felt a sudden, terrifying rush of power, the kind that only comes when you realize that the person holding the keys to the cage is you, and you have been holding them the whole time. I was done being the bank, and it was time for the bank to close its doors forever. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the ledger of my life one last time, but I did not look at the numbers. I looked at the ghosts of the adults I had failed to raise. When you pay the bills for a functional human being, you are not a savior, you are a thief. I stole the grit from Courtney's hands. I robbed Ryan of the calluses he needed to develop to hold on to his own life. By making their world easy, I made them useless. You think you are protecting them from the cold, but you are only ensuring they will freeze the moment you are no longer there to be their furnace. My children did not have a father. They had a service contract. I was a subscription they renewed every time a credit card reached its limit or a tuition deadline loomed. If your child only speaks to you when there is an overdue balance or a business opportunity that needs a jumpstart, you do not have a relationship. You have a transaction where you are the only one losing capital. I spent my life guarding a vault for strangers, yet I let my own blood treat my retirement like an interest-free loan with no repayment date. Your children have decades to recover from a financial storm. They have time to work 2 jobs or move into a smaller place. You do not. Every $1,000 you pull from your savings to cover their luxury or their laziness is a week of care you will not have when you are bedridden. It is the medication you will have to skip because the check did not come. Your old age is your responsibility and yours alone. I learned that on a cold blue chair in a hospital hallway while my daughter was calculating her next vacation on my dime. Self-preservation is not a sin. It is the only way to ensure you do not end your days as a burden to the very people who refused to carry you when they had the strength. I thought I was being a hero by never saying no, but I was just an enabler who financed his own loneliness. The money you give them is a poison that atrophies their character and starves your future. I had to go bankrupt in my own heart to realize that the most loving thing I could have done 20 years ago was to close the vault and tell them to go to work. Now I sit in the silence of this condo, and I realize that a father's true inheritance is not the money he leaves behind, but the strength he forces his children to find within themselves when he finally stops paying for their mistakes. I look at the clock on my kitchen wall, and I hear every tick as a reminder that time is the one resource I no longer have in abundance. I saw the bottom of my own well, and it was not empty. It was filled with the faces of the people I loved most, waiting for me to give them things I could no longer afford to lose. If you still have control over your retirement, if you still have a single cent that belongs to your future, close your hand today. Do not wait until you are hunched over in a hospital room, staring at a silent phone to discover that your wallet was always fuller than your children's hearts. Stop financing their dependency right now, because you are not helping them. You are only ensuring that you will be the one left shivering when the fire goes out. If they get angry, let them. Let the resentment burn if it must. It is 1,000 times better to have an angry child who is forced to become an adult than to be a father begging for his own dignity from the very people he raised to be hollow. Take action before the sun goes down. Close the vault. Cut the ties. Save yourself before your time and your money run out together, and you are left with nothing but the cold realization that you paid for your own disappearance.